Who is here? Project?
Microphone.
Okay. Oh, fine.
Does that work? I was told it's a microphone.
Well, I'm looking at it.
On the camera.
It looks more like a transponder from Star Trek.
Yeah, all right. So, well, does this sound?
It only records it onto the camera. It doesn't project it into the room.
Ah, all right.
Got it.
Okay.
It's my fault. Sorry, that's useless to you. Beam me up, Scotty.
I will use my leftover third grade voice, if I can, from many years ago. My teacher voice from third grade, yes. That was a lot. I used to have a whistle as well, just to make sure, but don't have the whistle with me anymore. I am very pleased in particular to have this topic addressed because it has been a vastly overlooked and underexplored topic for many, many years, maybe like 40 to 50 years in education, and it's hard to find in many graduate schools of education any focused look at the curriculum as opposed to the instruction, because C and I usually go together. And by curriculum, I'm really talking about some of the fundamentals of the curriculum. And this has been the focus of core knowledge since its inception. As most of you, perhaps all of you know, core knowledge began a few years after E.D. Hirsch published Cultural Literacy. That was when his book came out. And I don't remember how many years after that. You could probably fill me in.
1986. So it was about a year later.
A year later, he began the Core Knowledge Foundation in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the point of that was to start working out the curricular issues, because it really matters what kids learn, what texts they read, what texts they write about, and it covered all areas, all major areas of the curriculum, not just the four big ones. It included art and music as well, which pleased me even more. So I think this is a topic we really need to spend a lot more time on, particularly if there can be research for it. But in any event, I want to just say that I'm really happy that we have Rob here from the Core Knowledge Foundation, where he'll certainly tell you a whole lot more about what they're now doing, particularly in response to the Common Core standards, which have left curriculum up to the states and local school districts so far as we can see right now. But the big question mark is what happens when the Common Assessment specs get developed. And I know that that's taking place right now, and it's not quite clear what's going to happen at the level of curriculum. Let me just read you a little bit about his background. Rob left his position as the communications director for Business Week magazine to teach 5th grade in a struggling South Bronx elementary school. Today, he performs communication and advocacy work on behalf of education nonprofits, most notably Core Knowledge Foundation. His articles and op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, Education Week, Forbes, Business Week, Education Next, the New York Sun, and elsewhere. He writes and edits the Core Knowledge blog, which covers pre-K to 8 education issues. So keep that in mind, because Core Knowledge has, from the very beginning, by a decision made by Don Hirsch originally, not looked at the high school curriculum. It's been a pre-K to 8 curriculum. Prior to his becoming involved in education, Pondiscio spent nearly 20 years in print and broadcast journalism. He served as public affairs director for Time magazine, and he is the author of a series of books for young readers, including the Internet Guides, Kids Online, Ultimate Online Homework Helper, and Get on the Net. So I'm happy to have Rob here to talk about curriculum, the overlooked lever, and something that I would add is under-researched, although there has been a little bit of research that Core Knowledge itself has done, and maybe you can touch a little bit upon the results if you're on top of them, but I don't want to interfere with what your prepared remarks
No, thank you very much. And can everybody hear me in the back? Okay, great. I was joking with Misty before that I'm from New York, so I'm loud and I talk fast. But sometimes I mumble, so if I start mumbling, just raise your hand and say, or yell at me, just say, speak up. I wish, Sandra, that we were having this talk a week from now, because on Tuesday of next week, I'm going to a meeting at the Department of Education in New York City to look at the second-year results of our Core Knowledge Language Arts initiative. We're piloting a new curriculum in 10 schools. The kindergarten results were great. We're getting the first grade results next year. We hear that we're going to be happy, but I have no idea what those results are going to be. But thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here. And I want to say that I find it, first of all, deeply odd to be here. Because I'm not an academic, I'm not a researcher, I'm not even a policy wonk. I'm not even sure, if you listen to Sandra's introduction, that I can give you a proper job description for what I do in education. I mean, I'm broadly speaking, I'm an advocate. You've had real grown-ups in this speaker series. I'm not in the same league, but I thank Jay Green and Sandra Stotsky for having me, and now I'm going to do my level best to make them sorry they invited me. So look, this is the Department of Education Reform, and my topic is curriculum, and I was originally going to call this talk, as recently as this morning, Curriculum Education Reform's Redheaded Stepchild, but then I thought I should be more grown-up, so I changed it. But let me get out of the way a few of my personal biases about education reform, so you'll know exactly where I stand on certain issues. Because I'm really going to talk about curriculum, not necessarily ed reform per se. So, number one, I love charter schools. As a fifth grade teacher in the South Bronx, I spent a lot of time quietly trying to persuade the parents of some of my students to leave my school and enroll at a charter school nearby, including the original KIPP Academy, which was about half a mile from my school. Number two, I think teacher quality matters, and I think it matters a lot. There are too many lousy teachers in schools. We know this. If you work in curriculum, you're only as good as the teachers that are implementing your curriculum, so it matters. And nobody, by the way, is more acutely aware of the damage that bad teachers do than those who are trying to undo that damage. So I'm all for teacher quality. Number three, I am staunchly pro-accountability, and I'm not opposed to testing. They call it public education for a reason. Taxpayers are entitled to have some assurances that their money's being well spent. Sometimes this is easy. The garbage gets picked up or it doesn't. The mail comes or it doesn't. It's much harder, obviously, to determine if a school or a teacher is any good, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. In principle, it's an essential idea. And speaking of principle, and speaking only for myself, not for core knowledge necessarily, I personally believe very strongly in school choice, and I like vouchers. I'm aware of the arguments, both pro and con. There's evidence it works, there's evidence it doesn't. For me, it's a matter of personal principle. I couldn't see forcing the students in my school to stay there one more day than they had to. I would have loved to have seen vouchers get them out. My daughter goes to private school, so I benefited from choice personally. I was a public school kid. My wife was a private school girl. I believe in choice. My wife believes in exercising it. So choice is an intrinsic good. I support your right to choose. I even support your right to choose badly. You know, or you should know, at least you should know, what's best for your child. Fine. Number four, teacher tenure. I'm agnostic. Until I became a teacher, I never had a guarantee of lifetime employment. Every job I'd ever had outside of education, I would go to work every day, I would do my job, I'd get along with my colleagues, and that was what you did. And when I became a teacher, I pretty much followed the same model. Having tenure did not affect who I was and what I did. And I think, honestly, it's the same for most teachers. The inner city school teaching experience is not the story of tenured layabouts in the main who are refusing to teach and not getting fired. In my experience, it's mostly about good people trying their best and failing. And that's different. And by the way, if I were the head of the New York City Teachers Union, I would go to Mayor Bloomberg tomorrow and I would make the following proposal. I would say, Mr. Mayor, we're willing to make a deal right now that 1/3 of all new teachers will never receive tenure. And the mayor would say, are you kidding me? 1 out of 3 new teachers never get tenure? Well, if you think about it, 37% of New York City teachers, new teachers, never last until their 3rd year in the classroom. So already you've got a situation where 4 out of 10 new teachers never get tenured. So I'm not sure it's a big issue, but that's just me speaking. So I love charters and choice. I'm all for improving teacher quality. I'm pro-accountability. I'm not against testing. And you can do away with tenure tomorrow, and I will shed no bitter tears. Did I mention I love charter schools? Because I love charter schools. Love them. Love them. I say this as a preamble to what will follow. The bottom line is I think of myself, even as a curriculum advocate, as very much in the ed reform camp. But I spend most of my time thinking and writing and speaking about curriculum. Not because I don't think those other things are important, especially for the kinds of kids that I used to teach in the South Bronx, but I've just become increasingly impatient, as I think Jay and Sandra know, with a view of education reform that is chiefly concerned with structural reform, with funding mechanisms, with data, with charter, and remains largely incurious about what actually happens inside the classroom, what teachers teach and what children learn. So, my mission today is not to persuade you that structural reforms are bad. They're not. I mentioned I love charter schools, right? With Waiting for Superman, ed reform is a hot topic again. It sparked yet another national dialogue about the education crisis. I'm not sure if we're numbering them now, but it's a high number. But strangely, unforgivably absent in this national dialogue is anything about what our children do in school all day. So we're not having a national dialogue right now, we're having a national shouting match. Just fire bad teachers has become the new just say no. So I submit to you that without attending to what children learn, to curriculum, concern about the sorry state of our schools will continue to veer from an acute to a chronic condition, but it will never go away. Moreover, I will suggest that without attending to curriculum, some otherwise beneficial reforms, like testing and accountability, might even have a deleterious effect and fall even further into disrepute. But first, let me contextualize all this for you and explain to you how I came to this point of view. Up until 10 years ago, as Sandra mentioned, I had this very nice life in the warm bosom of corporate America. I ran the public affairs department at Time Magazine and at Business Week. I had a nice office, had an even nicer expense account. It was indoor work, there was no heavy lifting. But then one day I was seduced by an ad on the New York City subway system, I think I even have it, there it is, for the New York City Teaching Fellows, if you know the program. It was an alternative certification program, kind of like Teach for America, but it was aimed at mid-career professionals, guys like me. And the ad said, there it is, you remember your first grade teacher's name, who will remember yours? How can you resist that? I was seduced. I signed up. Fast forward a few months, and after 6 weeks of teacher training, or teacher boot camp more accurately, I found myself teaching 5th grade at PS 277, which is in the South Bronx. Now, a little background here is in order as well. Here is PS 277. If you know the New York City school system, there it is. The South Bronx is District 7. District 7 is the lowest scoring district in the city of New York. And that school is the lowest scoring school in District 7. So it was by definition the lowest of the low. So put yourself in my situation. In June, I leave my cushy office job. In September, I'm teaching school in 5th grade in a school that is literally the worst of the worst in the largest school system in America. So what does that look like exactly? Well, let me contextualize this. The test scores of my students showed that fewer than 20%, I think the actual number was 16%, of the 4th graders the previous year, these were my current 5th graders, were reading at or above grade level. So to put it another way, 4 out of 5 of my students could not read. They'd failed their reading test. So I had not spent a day in an elementary school since I'd been an elementary school student. Remember, I was in another walk of life. So I assumed, not unnaturally, I think, that my classroom would be filled with kids who could not read. I mean, that's what the test said, right? They couldn't read. To use a word that I didn't know before I became a teacher, I assumed they would not be able to decode, to actually turn the sounds or turn the letters into sounds and words and sentences and whatnot. So this may surprise you. In 5 years at this school, again, the lowest of the low, every child black or Hispanic, every child free and reduced lunch, in the poorest congressional district in America, I never had one single student who could not decode. Not one. Not ever. You know, some of them were surely more fluent than others, but they could all decode. What they couldn't do was comprehend. And that's different. Now, this is a phenomenon that I quickly came to understand is fairly common in struggling schools. And just by the way, how many in the room have ever taught in a low-performing elementary school? Okay, very, very few. Interesting. Okay, so this is going to all be very familiar to you, and maybe this will be an epiphany to the rest. If you teach in a school like this, you get this phenomenon all the time where students they could all decode, and it's the phenomenon known as, I read it, but I didn't get it. And you're nodding your head. You see this. That's what reading failure looks like in struggling elementary schools. Yes, there are some number of kids who struggle with decoding, but there are far, far more who read it and don't get it. Now that was a surprise. But here's what surprised me even more. Our response to that. See, when I became a teacher, I learned another word that I'd never heard before, which was metacognition. Thinking about thinking. So the reason my students read it but didn't get it was because they were not thinking about their thinking while they were reading. That's what I was told. They were not sufficiently steeped in reading strategies, metacognitive reading strategies, because you see, when good readers read, or so I was led to believe, they question the author. They think about their purpose in reading. They make text-to-self connections, and text-to-world connections, and text-to-text connections. I thought, well, that's kind of strange. When I'm thinking about when I'm reading, I'm not thinking about my thinking, I'm thinking about what I'm reading. But it did not resemble in any way, shape, or form how I learned how to read. But remember, it had been 30 years since I'd been in an elementary school, and I figured, well, what did I know? It's been a long time. But there was still the fact of those lousy test scores. 4 out of 5 kids were failing reading. So in my grad school classes and all the professional development that I was given, I'd ask about all that metacognition, all those reading strategies. If kids are struggling to understand simple text, I'd say, aren't they also going to struggle with knowing which reading strategies to apply? Are they going to have the wherewithal to know when to do what? And isn't it kind of distracting to read a book and stop every few seconds and write a little jotting on a Post-it note and stick it in your book? I mean, look at the books these kids read. It looks like an unmade bed. They carry these things around with these notes hanging out of them. Surely this is going to disrupt the flow of their reading, right? It's like, no, Mr. Pondiscio, we know so much more today about how children learn. Well, of course you do, I would think. So that explains why test scores are going through the roof, right? Well, to make a long story short, I got a little bit cynical very quickly I got a lot cynical quickly about the way we were teaching kids how to read. And eventually, on my own, I discovered this guy named D.D. Hirsch. And he'd written articles and books about background knowledge and how a lack of common shared knowledge made it difficult for low-income kids to understand even the simplest of texts. Well, I learned a lot from Hirsch, from reading him, about language and vocabulary and reading comprehension. It all made perfect sense to me. And when I would invoke Hirsch's name in my grad school classes and at professional development, I would invariably hear the same thing. Oh, that's that dead white guy stuff. Nobody takes that seriously. It's like, well, why not? I would argue, why not? This is what I'm seeing in my classroom every day. This guy gets it. This explains what I'm seeing right in front of me. My students have never had a single day of history, of geography. They don't get science. They don't get art or music ever. They don't understand a thing about life beyond 149th Street. Their walking around knowledge is non-existent. It's embarrassing. One of the brightest students I ever taught was under the impression that New Jersey was another country. And no, in case you're wondering, she was not being ironic. So what were we doing at this school to ameliorate this lack of background knowledge? Well, nothing. Not one damn thing. We weren't concerned about it at all. In fact, I wish I had $1 for every one of my colleagues or somebody else I heard say, oh yeah, history and science and all that stuff is important, but it can wait until after we teach the kids how to read. Well, it doesn't work that way. Unless kids have broad background knowledge, they will never be strong readers. They can't be strong readers without that. So I want to talk for a few minutes about reading, specifically how we teach it, how we test it, and why this is critical, I think, for education reform. And I want to share something that I never learned in grad school. In fact, if there's one thing that you take away from this talk, I hope this is it. That sounds counterintuitive. Reading is not a skill. Because you think of reading like riding a bike, right? If you could ride your bike, you can ride your next door neighbor's bike and his next door neighbor's bike. It's all riding a bike. And the same thing, reading is reading is reading. You may read faster than I do. I may read slower than you do. But my guess is if you think about reading at all, and your ability to read, you perceive it as not just a skill, but a transferable skill. Once you learn how to read, you can read a novel, you can read a box score, you can read a memo from the CEO, you can read Jay's blog. It's binary, right? Either you can do it or you can't. Well, that view of reading is only partially correct. the ability to translate written symbols into sounds or decoding, as we discussed, that is a transferable skill. Here, try this. Okay. These are 5 nonsense words. And my guess is we would all agree how they're pronounced. It's rigfap, trivet, knapsate, pagbo, and plizzle. Anybody disagree? Okay. What if we put an E at the end of trivet? Turbite, right? How can we do this? Okay, that's a miracle. None of us would disagree how to pronounce these words, even though they don't even exist. And this is because we're all very, very good decoders. We have internalized the pronunciation of the English language. In short, we have mastered the code. Good for us. Now, chances are also pretty good that you've mastered and internalized language structure as well, whether you realize it or not. Here's the first line of Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, which I'm sure you all know because you all went to fine schools. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe." What are the nouns? Toves, wabe. Another one there? Okay, brillig. 'Twas brillig. It was brillig. Brillig's a noun. What part of speech are gyre, or gyre if you prefer, and gimble? Verbs. These words don't even exist. And not only can you pronounce them, you know the parts of speech. Isn't that amazing? So decoding is transferable. We can all agree. But reading is not about decoding, is it? It's about comprehension. And comprehension is not a transferable skill. Here's a headline from The Onion last month. I love this. Okay, now some of you are laughing. Now if you are laughing, it's because you have a lot of background knowledge. Okay, you know that A-Rod is Alex Rodriguez. You know he's the Yankees' third baseman. You probably know that he used to play for the Texas Rangers. You know he's the highest paid player in baseball. You know that the Rangers traded him to the Yankees. You know that the Yankees lost to the Rangers in the ALCS. You know that A-Rod played poorly. You may also know that A-Rod is a little bit of a putz. And that he has a history of choking in the playoffs. And that makes the joke that much more delicious. Unless you're a Yankee fan. Now, if you didn't laugh, my guess is that it's not because you have a poor sense of humor. You just lack the content knowledge to get the joke. Or maybe you're a Yankee fan. The way we teach reading in elementary school assumes that reading is a transferable skill. That is, once you learn how to decode, you can learn how to read anything. If you practice and master those metacognitive reading comprehension strategies, then you're fully equipped to make sense of any text as long as you understand all or nearly all of the words. It makes sense because that's what we do. Okay, let's try it, shall we? I'll give you a second to take this in. Let's use our reading strategies. Okay, let's determine the author's purpose, shall we? Well, this is clearly an account of a cricket match, right? He's talking about wickets. I vaguely remember that wickets are part of crickets. That's what this is about. So the author's clearly trying to tell us what happened in a cricket match played by the Australian cricket team, because it says every run Australia mustered, so I know Australia's in the game. Okay, now visualization, that's another very important metacognitive reading strategy. So let's visualize a cricket match, shall we? Is that helping? No? Not there yet? Okay. Let's make text-to-world connections, all right? Connect the passage in your mind to something that you already know about. If you know about baseball, maybe your knowledge of baseball will help you make sense of this passage. Working? No? Okay. Well, you know, baseball, they're both, and cricket, they play with balls and bats. That gives me some content knowledge I can fall back on. Still not helping. All right, so let's use the strategy, question the author. All right, here's my question for the author. What the hell are you talking about? You know all the words. You understand the broad context. You're all very well-educated people. You can apply reading strategies until the sun goes out. You're never going to make sense of that, unless, of course, you know cricket. You know, I lack the content knowledge to make sense of that. You probably do, too. And if you think this is an obscure example, take out a new product warranty sometime for your refrigerator, or go online and try to troubleshoot your computer if you're not technically minded, and you'll have the same result. you'll feel like a fourth grader who's sort of struggling to understand a difficult reading passage. But let me anticipate another objection. You're going to say, oh, you're picking topics or obscure passages. Fourth graders are never going to be asked about cricket on a state reading exam, right? Well, fair enough. Here's this. This is a fifth grade reading exam. Carly heard the buzzer, which was the signal to begin her descent. The thoughts whirling around in her head quickly disappeared, and she dug her ski poles into the packed snow. She leaned forward and began speeding down the steep snow-covered mountains. Her heart was thumping. Her breath came in quick gulps, and she knew there was no turning back, no time for fear. This is a fifth grade reading test, and it's a passage, obviously, perhaps, about a ski race. Strangely enough, it's from Texas, which is not a state that we normally associate with skiing. As she raced downhill, Carly saw that the first turn was coming faster than she'd expected. A spray of snow filled the air as she skidded wildly around the flag. For one horrifying moment, she thought she had leaned too far to the left and would crash. However, she managed to shift her weight and regain her balance. Stupid, she told herself angrily, but there was no time to think about what she had done wrong. She was already rushing toward the next flag. Now, a fair question is, why is there a test passage about ski racing on the TAKS, the Texas reading test? Well, the reason is because reading is a transferable skill, right? It shouldn't matter that you have no experience or background knowledge with skiing. Determine the author's purpose. Activate your prior knowledge. Reading is reading is reading. But even simple texts, as you may know, like these on reading tests, are filled with gaps, which are presumed domain knowledge that the writer assumes that the reader knows. And it's more than just vocabulary. Okay, this passage mentioned buzzers and flags. Well, what do buzzers and flags have to do with skiing? I know that's what snow is, but the passage mentioned packed snow. I'm not sure I understand what that is. There was snow in the air as she skidded wildly. So that must mean it's snowing, right? And that she can't see. Is she supposed to grab that flag? I'll make a text-to-self connection or text-to-world connection. Maybe this is like capture the flag. Maybe that's what she's doing. That's going to be hard in a blizzard. No wonder she's angry. If you're not familiar with the context of even simple things like this is no different, I would argue, than being shown the dreaded finger or being adjudged leg before if you're a fourth grader in San Antonio. But again, reading tests assume that reading is a broad how-to skill that we can easily measure and assess. Background knowledge doesn't matter. So we judge our schools and increasingly individual teachers based on their ability to improve the reading skills of our children. Now, it's no mystery why affluent children are better readers. They have more background knowledge. They've got bigger vocabularies. They travel, they visit museums, they have rich conversations with their mom and dad over the dinner table, they watch Animal Planet. They're little contextualizing machines, aren't they? But the kids that I taught, I would describe as school-dependent learners. That means if they don't learn it in school, they don't learn it at all. So what do we do with these kids? Well, we take the kids who show up at school, they're already behind, and we go out of our way to make sure they don't get what they need to close the language gap. Lots and lots of content. If we don't teach low-income kids history, science, geography, music, and art, if we don't make that education as rich as possible, they're not going to learn how to read. They will read it, but they won't get it. My friend Dan Willingham puts this very simply. Teaching content is teaching reading. And I won't do this to you, but if you have a chance, go on YouTube this afternoon or this evening and take a look at a 10-minute video that Dan put on YouTube with this exact title, called Teaching Content is Teaching Reading. It's basically everything E.D. Hirsch has written about for 25 years in 10 minutes on YouTube. It's brilliant. This idea, by the way, has been thoroughly tested. Poor readers outperform good readers who lack relevant background knowledge. So this is not just me saying this. See, reading is what cognitive scientists like Dan Willingham would call domain-specific. You have to know a little bit about the subject, and sometimes a lot about the subject, to make sense of it. The same thing is also true, by the way, about creativity, about problem solving, about critical thinking. I read a paper once, I can't remember the author, called Could Steven Spielberg Manage the Yankees? The answer is no. He's a creative genius, but he's a creative genius filmmaker. It's not a transferable skill. I'm not an all-purpose genius or critical thinker or problem solver. There's no such thing. Those are domain-specific, and so is reading comprehension. One well-known study looked at junior high school students who were either good or bad readers based on standardized tests. In both groups, there were some who knew a lot about baseball and some who knew a little bit about baseball or nothing about baseball. They were all given a passage written on, I believe, the 5th grade level that described the action in an inning of a baseball game. And very cleverly, they had a model baseball field in front of them. And as they read the passage, they would be asked to stop and show what just happened on the diamond. Now, keep in mind, if reading comprehension was a skill, a transferable skill that could be taught, practiced, and mastered, which is the way we teach it and test it, then the students who are good readers should have no trouble outperforming the poor readers on such a test, right? Either you're a good reader or you're not. Well, here's what happened. The good readers who did not know baseball got 18.8 on average out of 40 answers correct. The poor readers, according to standardized tests, who knew baseball, got 27.5 out of 40 correct. This stuns the heck out of me. And it should stun the heck out of everybody. What this means is knowing a lot about the subject makes you a good reader. So who is the good reader and who is the bad reader? Is it the kid who spends the most time practicing metacognitive reading strategies? Or is it the kid with the broadest base of general knowledge? Because general knowledge and reading comprehension correlate. Now, if you were starting in elementary school and you knew this, where would you focus your energies? Broad general knowledge is reading comprehension ability. So surely our data-driven, research-based schools are falling all over each other to build language arts instruction around domain-specific core curriculum, right? They are, aren't they? They're not? Oh, well then teacher licensing boards must surely know this, and they must be bending over backwards to make sure that elementary schools have subject matter discipline expertise, right? No? Not happening? Okay. Leon Botstein at Bard College reorganized his teacher training program around this a few years ago, as I recall. I'm not sure what happened to it, but he said he was going to do this instead of, quote, the pseudoscience of pedagogy, which nobody ever called him on that term, calling pedagogy a pseudoscience, but I thought it was brilliant. Now, if you've never spent any time in a struggling elementary school, I would strongly, strongly urge you to do so. You'll see posters all around the room in child-friendly language that look like this. You'll see this in teacher handwriting. Good readers ask good questions. They make connections when they read, etc. This is what reading instruction looks like in elementary schools. You'll also see teachers doing think-alouds. They're reading out loud to their students, and they're interrupting their reading every couple of seconds to ask themselves questions. They're modeling the habits, we call it, of good reading. They're demonstrating to students what good readers do and encouraging their students to do the same. I have a name for this. I call this cargo cult reading. Richard Feynman wrote about cargo cults, if you know this passage. He described these primitive people in the South Sea. And during World War II, what happened? They saw all these planes landing and all this cool stuff coming out of the planes, food and supply, all this cargo. And then the war ended and the planes went away. They wanted to make the planes come back. So what did they do? They built runways. They put fires alongside the runway. They made giant huts or like control towers out of branches and trees. They put guys in them with helmets and sticks out of the side of their head like antenna. They even made planes out of bamboo. They look like this. Okay, it's a decoy to attract more planes. Feynman wrote, "The form is perfect. It looks exactly the way it looked before, but it doesn't work. No airplanes land. They follow all the apparent precepts and forms of scientific investigation, but they're missing something essential because the planes don't land." In cargo cult reading, the essential missing ingredient is content. Reading strategies have some benefit. Don't get me wrong. They teach kids that a text is supposed to make sense, and that's valuable, but it's not enough to guarantee comprehension. One of the pre-reading strategies we teach children is that good readers activate their prior knowledge before they read. Well, how exactly does that work when you have no prior knowledge to activate? Without content knowledge, our kids are just sitting in the jungle, just waiting for the planes to land. So here's what you'll see in an elementary school. Every morning in Reader's Workshop, young children will learn what good readers do. Then they go off and practice the strategies in small groups or independently, reading books that they choose themselves at their just right reading level. And then they go to Writer's Workshop, where the teacher calls them writers or authors, and where they never write on a subject other than one they choose themselves. So what do they write about? Themselves, or their mamas, or the time they visited grandma in the hospital, or wrestling, or video games. We're cheating these kids. We're cheating them of the rich and robust content knowledge that you and I and the vocabulary take for granted that affluent children come to school with every day. So why are these children reading books that they only choose themselves? Why are they only writing about their personal experiences? Well, Mr. Pondiscio, the most important thing is student interest and engagement. Teach the child, Mr. Pondiscio. Don't teach the lesson. The most important thing we can do as educators is create a lifelong love of learning and reading and books. Well, okay, maybe it's just me. I don't love things I'm no damn good at. If we want children to be lifelong readers, to love books, the best way to do that, in my humble opinion, is to make them really good readers. And that means engaging kids with content, and by that I don't mean just the contents of their heads. Here's a quote from one of my favorite literacy gurus. This is Lucy Calkins, whose work pretty much dominates the New York City school system in literacy. She's probably right about this. I will grant her that. Far be it from me to disagree with my betters. I can think of exactly two ways to correct this lamentable situation. The first would be to de-emphasize spelling and grammar. The second would be to teach spelling and grammar. But instead, of course, it's more important for a fifth grader to unburden his or her 10-year-old soul writing personal essays about small moments in their memoirs. It's more important to write a personal response to literature than to actually engage with the content. This is supposed to be authentic writing, not phony academic work like book reports and research papers. So this, folks, is how we teach reading and writing all across this country. This is how we're getting our children college and career ready. And by the way, and this is the important part, this is how they do it in public schools and in charter schools. This is how good teachers learn to teach ELA and bad teachers. This is the approach to literacy that dominates union schools and non-union schools. And my friends in education reform seem to agree with this, either in fact or by their indifference. So, I'm not down on ed reform. But while the policy wonks are worried about lifting the charter caps and defanging the unions, about using value added to decide which teachers to fire, this is the kind of child-centered, kindly, well-intentioned nonsense that's going on in our elementary schools. All of them. Right, most all of them. If you push structural reforms without attending to the curricular content of schooling, you will have change. What you won't have is improvement. It ends up being merely a second flavor of bad. And a view of policy, I would argue, that doesn't include curriculum has the potential to move schools that serve our most disadvantaged children from bad to worse. So this is why I will argue until I'm blue in the face that until or unless we start attending to curriculum, to what children learn, and fill their heads with as much knowledge of the world, as much schema, as Lucy Calkins says, there are strict limits to how much juice we're going to squeeze out of teachers in schools. This is why people like me yell and scream about curriculum narrowing. When we assume that reading is a transferable skill and we sacrifice art and music and history and science and all the rest, we're making things worse. We're not making things better. This is what E.D. Hirsch has been writing about for 25 years. The more you know, the more you're able to communicate and comprehend. The implications of this insight for teaching children to read should be obvious. The more our children receive, the more knowledge they receive, the more capable they will become as readers and writers. The achievement gap is a knowledge gap. Job one for low-performing schools has to be to address this aggressively from the first days of school. So why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we insisting that elementary school curricula be astonishing in its breadth? Why don't we insist that elementary school is foundational for academic success? Why don't we make sure that every child can decode and then gets the broad knowledge that will set him or her on a path to college and career readiness, real college and career readiness? We know that the overwhelming majority of kids who read below grade level in elementary school never catch up. So what's our policy prescription for this? Well, this is Race to the Top. It has 19 criteria. God himself had only 10, but Arnie Duncan has 19. Not one about curriculum. Oh, but we can't tell teachers what to teach. It's wrong, it's heavy-handed, it's dictatorial, it's illegal. We can't let a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington determine what our children need to know. A national curriculum, that's unthinkable, it's a third rail. Okay, quick show of hands. Raise your hand if you think there are children who do not need to know the following, or if you object to teaching kindergartners the following. These are all out of the core knowledge sequence. Anyone object? Anyone ready to go to war? Well, hell, no damn government going to tell me my kid has to know his shapes and colors. It's the principle, right? We all agree that these are things that kids should know, but we want to decide for ourselves. Thank you very much. I'll decide what shapes and colors my child will learn. So fine, you decide. But can we at least do this? Let's tell parents and teachers in all 50 states that their children will be better readers and better writers if the schools, if they insist, and the schools deliver a content-rich, coherent, thoughtfully sequenced curriculum, where knowledge builds on knowledge, where it grows deeper and broader every year. If we did that, if we left the decision to all 50 states, you know what would happen? Just a hunch. Arkansas will decide that children need to learn their shapes and colors. They'll decide that they need to know the names of the oceans and the parts of a plant. And so will Delaware, and so will Maine, and so will Idaho, and so will Hawaii. So fine, no national curriculum. I don't want to see National Guard troops marching 5-year-olds into schools in Mississippi to teach them that yellow and blue make green. Okay? I'm pretty sure that a 3-sided figure is called a triangle, even in Texas. But I don't want to have a fight about it. So no national curriculum. It's off the table. But can we at least agree, ed reformers, that there must be a curriculum? Can we make sure the message goes out that the more kids know about the world in which they live, the better they will read? Can we at least agree that a shared body of knowledge in elementary school is a damn fine idea? Can we at least make sure the word gets out that teaching content is teaching reading? And can we make sure, finally, that every school has a coherent, sequenced K-5 curriculum? And can we back it up with accountability to make sure that it actually gets taught to our most disadvantaged kids? Pretty please? Now, right about now, you might be thinking, okay, well, wait a minute, that's what the Common Core standards are all about, right? Well, not really. Standards, at least ELA standards, are what is known as process standards. They're not content standards. They tell what children should be able to do, not what they should actually learn and be taught. In short, standards are not curriculum. They're not very useful for teachers planning lessons. I mean, I know that as a New York City school teacher, not once did I ever summon my class to the rug and say, okay, boys and girls, this is so exciting. Today we're going to learn to listen, to read, and analyze and evaluate experiences, ideas, and information and issues from a variety of perspectives. Won't that be fun, boys and girls? You don't use these things to plan lessons. Core Knowledge has been strongly supportive of the Common Core standards for one very, very good reason. It's a step in the right direction. And let's start with the title. Common Core Standards for English Language Arts and Literacy in History, Social Studies, Science, and Technical Subjects. Well, right now, this is something new under the sun. It's not merely ELA, not merely English Language Arts, but it's English Language Arts in all the subject areas in elementary school. So somebody's getting the message. Mazel tov, as we say in New York. And maybe you say that in Arkansas. We do, all right. Only if you're from New York. This is also from the Common Core Standards, and it's a call for building knowledge systematically with, and by the way, the reason I know this language is because we at Core Knowledge wrote this, but don't tell anybody. This calls for a sequenced curriculum across grades that systematically develops the knowledge base of students. Great. Notice I'm not talking about the standards themselves, but the directions that go with the standards. Again, it's a start. Okay? This is another one, right out of the Core Knowledge Handbook. By reading text in history, social studies, etc., it'll give them background knowledge, be better readers in all content areas. So the authors of the Common Core Standards get it. Now, is this the death knell for content-free reading and writing in the foundational elementary school years? No, of course not. But it's a start. But without a curriculum to support the standards, the Common Core Standards call explicitly for a curriculum. Doesn't mean you have to have them, but it says if you want this to work, got to have a curriculum. It's a start. Without a curriculum to support the standards and assessments that incentivize teaching it, I wouldn't be surprised between you and me if we see little or no change. This is the bottom line, a quote from my friend Dan Willingham. The idea that reading is a skill, that you learn to crack the code, practice comprehension strategies, and you can read anything, he says, is the single biggest factor holding back reading achievement in this country. And he's right. So, why do I like Common Core Standards? Because the clear, unambiguous call for a coherent curriculum by itself is significant. Does this mean the textbook publishers won't just change the covers on their textbooks and call them CCSS ready? No, of course they won't. But at least we're finally seeing some recognition of what Don Hirsch has been writing about for 25 years and what I saw in my classroom in the South Bronx. Curriculum matters. Teaching content is teaching reading. We can't expect to keep spoon-feeding children the same thin gruel year after year and hope that they magically transform into these deep readers and writers through the agency of the invisible hand. It's not happening. It's not going to happen. Right now, only 4%, this is an amazing figure, 4% of first grade class time in American schools is spent on science, 2% on social studies. In third grade, it's 5% for each. So where's all this time going right now? Well, you know, reading. The kind of stuff that we were talking about before. 62% in first grade, 47% in third grade is spent on language arts. So the Common Core standards call for a 50-50 split between fiction and literature, or poetry, literature, and nonfiction in the language arts block. If that actually happens, that is a huge leap forward. But that's a very, very big if. Because practices are entrenched. So, until this changes, I will continue to nudge my friends in ed reform to include curriculum on their to-do list of things for fixing schools. A charter school with the same faulty notions about teaching reading is only going to be incrementally better. A good teacher is not going to be that much better than a bad teacher if they're both saddled with the same lousy curriculum, or if they have no curriculum at all, which is what they usually have. And think of how much better they both could be if we insisted on reading instruction that made sense, that didn't ignore what we know about comprehension, or didn't condescend to children by assuming that if a book is not about their personal lives, that they couldn't possibly be interested or successful in reading it. So one last plea for ed reform to consider curriculum, and then I'll stop. I will leave you with a question. So please, in your own mind, rank from greatest to least the importance of each of the following factors in your own personal educational outcome. You make a mental list. So which of these brought you where you were sitting today? Was it testing and accountability? Was it your teacher's membership in a union? Was it data systems? Was it the type of school you went to? Was it your parents? Was it the content of your education? If you ask successfully educated people this question, I'm guessing that just about all of us would answer E or F. But where do most of the time, energy, and resources of education reformers, policymakers, and foundations go? To A, B, C, and D. So if we know that these are factors in our education, why do we rarely factor them into the work that we do for other people's children? Thank you. Questions? Okay, Jay's going to beat me up on standards, so I'm going to wait.
Don't worry. Knowledge is not the ugly.
The redheaded stepchild.
We love it as we love all of our.
And we love Edward.
I think you made an extremely persuasive case, but I'm worried about the bit where you seem to think that the indifference of education reformers is somehow a critical obstacle to this case being transferred into practice. So just to give I think people who focus on A through D are not hostile to E and F.
Right.
They are focusing on different things, just as when Gary Ritter works on merit pay and Pat works on vouchers, it doesn't mean that Pat doesn't care about merit pay. They just work on different things. And there's Don Hirsch and you, and I hope many other people working on this. But you still have to ask the question, why is it that E and F are not happening? Now, it may be that they're not happening because there are problems with A through D that prevent it from happening.
Sure.
And so, if we look around and see where are there core knowledge schools in the country, it turns out the lion's share of them are in charter schools.
Not quite accurate, but there's a significant number.
A school being a core knowledge school is many-fold higher if you're a charter school than if you're a traditional.
The percentage of charter schools, yes, absolutely.
Okay. So, and why is that?
Right.
And why is it that the current system is not interested in the case that you're making?
Right. Well,
and I suggest it has to do with A through D. So perhaps it's everyone working on A through D who helped you in getting E through F.
Right. To Jay's point, core knowledge operates all kinds. We don't operate. I should take that back. Our curriculum is in place in all kinds of schools, and it's roughly one third charters, private, public schools. But to your point, there are far fewer charter schools, therefore a higher percentage of them are core knowledge. But it's still a pretty small number when all is said and done. My point, and again, this is not a knock on ed reform. It's the lack of traction is just because of what Don Hirsch, I guess, has called the thought world in education, that simply does not accept this view of things and that is wedded to their version of how kids learn. I guess my frustration, my disappointment is that, and I was being somewhat arch about this by saying, oh, we're so data driven, and so why isn't this message getting into the charter world a little bit more deeply than it is? Even our highest performing charters, the great no excuses schools, the Achievement First and the KIPS and the Uncommons and whatnot. I don't have the data in front of me. I'm actually starting a project looking into this, but I understand that these kids, when they go to college at extraordinary rates, which is super, but they're not graduating in extraordinary rates. They're still having all of these problems. And you talk to folks at KIP, for example, and say, well, how come these kids are college ready? You get them through, they go to college, and I think the number is only 40% of them are graduating. It's a small sample, but still, small numbers are graduating. And they'll say, well, it's persistence. Because they need the habits of mind that enable them to persist in a difficult environment. And I look at that and I think, you're kidding me, right? They're not academically prepared. It's not persistence. If they were academically prepared, they would need less persistence. But for some reason, even folks who get it don't get it. And that's a frustration. So, also, where's all the energy in ed reform? I keep being cautioned. Don't paint ed reform with a broad brush. It's diverse. I get it. But where's the funding going? High schools, middle schools, college readiness. Where does it belong? Elementary school. This is where the battle is won and lost. I was talking to Jennifer last night, and I can't recall whose figure this is, but something like 90% of kids who do not read on grade level by third grade never read on grade level. So now there's two ways we can address this. We can continue to try to lock American education into this endless cycle of remediation, or maybe, just maybe, we should focus on making sure that fewer kids are not reading on grade level by the end of third grade. Solve the problem where it starts instead of spending the rest of your time trying to remediate it. That's just common sense to me. But for whatever reason, all the oxygen and energy is going someplace else. Again, I'm not pointing fingers here. I'm just suggesting, let us reason together. Let us, let's get the charter folks a little bit more engaged on this. We do some very good work with charters, but the brand name charter schools also sort of say, no, we have our own formula for this. They haven't quite gotten there yet. Sir.
So where are your points of attack right now? Your organization to try and pass this along. Are you going to colleges of ed to try and convince the leaders of these schools that no, actually we need to be focusing here? Because I'm saying, you might be able to convince an individual charter school to get their teachers to teach in a certain way, but if you still have an organization like the school here that is pumping out a lot of teachers who are thinking that it is all about skills, then you're just dealing with a small, throw it in the bucket and see, that's it.
Well, you do what you can do. Most of the energy, in fact, just about all of the energy at the Core Knowledge Foundation right now is aimed at developing something called the Core Knowledge Language Arts Program. You can read about this on our website. Quick 101 on core knowledge. What it really is a really muscular scope and sequence. It goes from pre-K to 8, and it lists sequentially and coherently, these are the topics that kids should learn grade by grade by grade, and it builds and cycles and grows over the years. Well, this is really hard to operationalize, frankly. If you're a teacher, we give you this sequence, and then we still expect that you're going to make up your own lessons and make it your own. We've traditionally never prescribed to teachers how to teach. As a classroom teacher, I can tell you I was only told how to teach. I was never told what to teach, which always struck me as being curious, to put it that way. So now we are developing the Core Knowledge Language Arts Program, which I wouldn't call it scripted, but it is certainly prescriptive. It lays out, it has two basic strands. There's the skills strand, which is all that decoding and phonics work that we were talking about, and then what's called the listening and learning strand. Because one thing that we know is that children's ability to process information and build vocabulary orally is far outruns their ability to do so in print until about 8th grade. So even the young children can take in a heck of a lot more information through their ears than through their eyes. So the listening and learning strand of this is designed to start to build this background knowledge through read-alouds from the very, very first days of school. This program right now has been developed and pilot tested in New York and 7 other cities in kindergarten, first, and second grade. And we are scouring the country right now looking for funding to continue this. So if you know any billionaires, please let me know. Billionaires who are thinking about things other than charter schools. We can do this with charter school. So that's what we're working on right now. Is we're trying to operationalize the curriculum by making it more I want to say but more prescriptive, so we can just drop it in the classroom, train the teachers in this general theory, in the phonics work. We're doing it in 10 New York City schools, 7 other schools. The results have been terrific. There's a Woodcock-Johnson test battery of early literacy skills, things like word attack and vocabulary, phonics recognition. And the kindergarten results showed 6 times greater gains in the test schools than the control schools in kindergarten. We're going to get the first grade results from the DOE next week. But that's where all the energy of the foundation is going right now, is to create this curriculum ultimately from pre-K to 5th grade.
Could I ask a question about this?
You just did. You want to ask another one?
Talk a little bit about who makes the decisions for what should be in a sequence, and where the principles for sequence may come from, where the authority is, because that relates to one of the critical issues.
I'm a little bit out of my depth on this, I will confess, because this happened long before I was in education. This was really the work that Don Hirsch and others at the start of the core knowledge experiment began. And as I understand it, there was a vast meeting convened of subject matter specialists in Charlottesville, Virginia in the late 80s. And they were basically charged, what is the indispensable knowledge that you feel that kids need to know? And at one point, there was this idea that, okay, if you want to add more stuff, you have to take more stuff out, or other stuff out. So it has to be a disciplined process. Look, we all know it's very, very difficult to agree on these things. And the further you get up in towards high school, the harder it gets. So, this is why I'm limiting my plea to elementary school. Surely we can agree. If you want to argue whether, Columbus was a great man or a cultural hegemonist, fine. You're not going to argue about that in kindergarten. Would it be helpful if people knew at least who he was in kindergarten? That's an obvious example, but, can we do something around the idea who's going to argue that coherence doesn't matter in elementary school? Who's going to argue that kids shouldn't have a foundation? But we just assume that we can't agree about these things, so we really make no effort to. And my point, I was being somewhat arch about it, but I mean it earnestly. If you ask different states, different districts, different parents, okay, what do kids need to know at what age? They're going to come to a consensus, I think. They did. That's what the core knowledge sequence is all about. Now, if we said, okay, we'll just adopt the sequence, then it becomes a commercial pitch and we're benefiting ourselves. So fine, don't do that. Do it on your own. But guess what? It's going to look an awful lot like what we came up with. Yes, ma'am.
Is core knowledge still doing the longitudinal study in the Delta of Arkansas with preschool children?
Ooh, I believe so, but I'm not a preschool guy. There's a woman at the foundation named Alice Wiggins who runs our school department. If you give me a card, you know Alice, yeah. Then she will have that data, and if you don't, it sounds like you don't need me to put you in touch with her, but...
I'm a consultant.
Okay, well, there you go.
So I just want to ask a question about the standards, the core standards. The new standards require a substantial amount of content knowledge.
No, they don't. Am I wrong about this?
In comparison to what we currently have in Arkansas, they do require more content knowledge. They do. There is more content knowledge required.
In the English language arts standards?
For the teachers who are teaching these things, they're going to have more content knowledge than they currently have.
The teachers themselves.
Yes.
Okay, I see that.
And yet we don't require much by way of training for teachers in content areas, like within.
Traditionally, that's the case.
And at this College of Education, that's the case. And so, as far as what teachers are going to have to, what changes are going to have to be made, from your perspective, regarding how teachers are trained?
Well, again, my area is elementary school. It's a very different kettle of fish when you're talking about high school. I received in my ed school not one day of training on subject specialty issues. It was all pedagogy. I don't think that's unusual. I think that's probably more common than not. Should we have more content knowledge specialists even at the elementary school level? Sure, especially in math. Goodness. If anything, I think it's going to happen in math first. But this idea, look, I mean, my whole point is that this idea that there's a connection, a hard and fast connection between your content knowledge and your reading comprehension is dimly understood, I think, even by most elementary school teachers. We got to get there first. Once that idea is sort of gains some currency and the Common Core standards help, then maybe from that you rethink teacher education. I may be naive about this. I don't think that it takes a whole heck of a lot of, with the exception of math perhaps, and reading. There was a paper by the AFT some years ago that teaching reading really is rocket science, and I think that's right. But in terms of sort of subject specialty in elementary school, I'm not sure that we need to have, a master's in history teaching second graders. Look, there's clearly a problem with the fact that a lot of teachers walk into the classroom having just as little subject knowledge as the kids do. That's no surprise. Core Knowledge, for example, produces these teacher handbooks that have we talk about scaffolding the kids. They scaffold the teachers. Here's all the background knowledge you need to teach westward expansion. Here's the vocabulary. Here's the knowledge kids should have. Here's what they're going to learn in 6th grade and 8th grade, so you can sort of place this in the continuum. I think that's helpful. But again, the real critical battle, I think, is not necessarily getting teachers to teach subject matter in elementary school, especially early ed. It's this idea that subject matter must be taught, and it must be coherent, and it must be sequential, and it must be as broad as possible if we want kids to be competent readers. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. Whether it's not only just the curriculum itself, but also the parents' access to the curriculum.
Sure.
For example, in China, it's very easy to get a textbook for primary school. You can go to any bookstore, probably a couple of bucks, you got the whole set of the school textbooks. So parents actually can help the kids and know what kids is learning in school. But here, last year, one of my friends in China wanted, because America still the idea of education for a lot of countries, including China, so they want to get a textbook of America. I think, okay, that's no problem. I assume I just like in China, you can go to some store and got the textbook, send them, and they can know what you guys are teaching. Unfortunately, it's not the case. And then I asked some of my friends that told me, in America, most of the primary school and elementary school, the textbook belongs to the school or the district, and it's not that easy to get the textbook
right.
For the school. By this way, a lot of parents maybe they don't have the access to help their kids, even though, as you said, the math of elementary school is not rocket science. And if we even don't need to change so much of the curriculum, we just get the access for parents. They can help the kids. Yeah. It's just the content. You said the content for elementary school. I don't think that any parents need much of training in the content. They can just help and not just the school for the curriculum.
One of the things we're talking at breakfast, Core Knowledge is very popular with homeschoolers, and the reason is if you've ever been to a Barnes & Noble or Borders, you may have seen the books, what your first grader needs to know, what your second grader needs to know, etc. Dr. Wolf is nodding, you know these books. Those essentially function as the textbooks for homeschoolers. And they mirror the core knowledge sequence. So if you go to a core knowledge school, then you could use those books for exactly the purpose that you described. Look, one of the other issues in elementary schools is textbooks are in disfavor, period. Because we want authentic literature. We don't want kids reading textbooks. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with this, but the curriculum is self-selected and is based on student interest and engagement. So how could you possibly have a textbook? The basal readers, we don't want those anymore. We want kids to choose their own books and follow their interests. So there is no, there's no curriculum, literally. So what you're doing. What are you told to do as a parent? Well, read with your kid 30 minutes a night. You learn some skills to make sure that they're reading at their just right level, etc. These aren't bad practices. They're just not enough. Kids need more than that, not less. Sir.
It sounds like, from what you said, that the need for this
is much greater in certain schools, in poor schools,
Yeah, I'd say so.
than in other schools. And obviously, I infer that this is coming from the different home environment that the students are coming from. It seems to me very, and I'm also at the same time trying to struggle with the question that's come up a few times, which is, why hasn't this been adopted? Okay. So perhaps part of the answer is, and I'm just asking,
Sure.
That in X number of schools, it's not needed, or it's not needed very much. And it's very hard, it seems to me, for an education teacher preparation program to prepare teachers for different kinds of schools. So, well, for this kind of school, you're going to need this, and for this kind of school, you're going to need that. And by the way, to add to the difficulty of most of the teachers who want to teach in this kind of school where it's maybe not needed, the easier schools to teach in, maybe that's an obstacle. I don't know. I'm struggling with, and this gets back, I think, to your question as well, or at least perhaps related. Which lever to push on? Right? Do you change the content? How much do we try to do in loco parentis in the school?
Right.
As opposed to a whole other approach, which some have taken, which is to try and educate the parents.
Right.
I'm just doing these out.
Yeah, so I'll respond to that a little bit. I think your point is well taken. And again, I'm painting with a very broad brush here because, ed reform is usually a proxy for what happens in low-income urban schools, is it not? We don't spend that much time worrying about reforming schools in Scarsdale for good reason. We have other fish to fry. I don't want to leave you with the impression that I think everything is fine in more affluent schools. I think kids' content knowledge is pretty appalling wherever. There've been every couple of weeks you read about another survey that shows how little kids know about their government, about anything. It's a hardy perennial. So I do think this is a universal issue. But I do think that the general level of walking around knowledge, for lack of better description, that more affluent kids have make this less of an impediment than it is. I use the phrase school-dependent learners. More affluent kids are more likely to find workarounds for these kinds of things if they're motivated. I think it's fatal for low-income kids. I'm not sure that answers your question. So I don't want to suggest that these things don't matter for more affluent kids, but it is especially crucial for the kinds of kids that we all work and try to help.
Rob,
Yes,
just
dear.
to piggyback a little bit on Bob's question, there are programs or courses that are now being developed in many ed schools for the training of urban teachers.
Thank you,
So
Jesus.
the question is, why have you looked at, do you know anything about the content of these programs? I would suspect they have almost no academic content because they're looking at other things rather than academic content, when the reverse might probably be.
Yeah, and again, I'm constantly accused, and I know I do this, of painting with too broad a brush. So let me do it again. When I went to Mercy College for my master's, not because I chose it, but because I was in the fellows program, and that's where they sent me. And they started their teacher training program from scratch for the New York City Teaching Fellows, and trained boxcar numbers of teachers every year. And I remember having this conversation all the time. Like, why isn't this an urban education program? Why is this just, standard ed school stuff? And I don't want to be unfair, but the answer you typically hear is, well, we should treat, the poorest children the way we treat the most affluent children. Look, Readers and Writers Workshop may be the greatest thing since sliced bread with raisins if you have all of this sort of schema and deep knowledge, and you want to write your memoirs, and you want to write these small moments, if you want to really become sort of a belle lettrist, But that's not what the kids that I taught needed. It may have been powerful and empowering for more affluent kids. It just didn't work in that setting. So I love the idea of sort of an urban-focused teacher training program. I don't know which ones you're referring to, but I would love to learn more about them. I think it's a great idea. Okay, now Jay's going to beat me up on. Yep.
I'll let James get in there. He hasn't had a chance.
How would you respond to the criticism that this is all a bit elitist? Presuming that you know what poor kids need to know, and you're going to tell them all the things that they need to learn. That sounds a bit elitist to me. And it seems like something we shouldn't be doing.
The reason I love Dan Willingham is because he is not from the ed school at the UVA. He's from the psychology department. So basically, and I think, if we're going to use a religious metaphor, but maybe I won't. He's a scientist. He comes at this in a dispassionate way. It happens that he says many of the same things that Hirsch says, but it's not theory. It's research. It's clinical psychology. So I guess the answer is there. In other words, we're not telling you what to teach your kids. We're telling you that this is what good readers know. Do you want your kid to be a good reader? Well, if you do, they need to have all of this stuff. It's value neutral. Willingham also described Hirsch's Cultural Literacy, I think this is brilliant, as the most misunderstood education book of the last 50 years. Because people who didn't read the book assumed that this was elitism. This was preserving white male privilege. This was, here's the list of 5,000 things. Don has such regrets about putting that list in the back of that book. Because that became what people know. It's the list. Alfie Cohen, it's a bunch of facts. No, it's not. It's a literacy strategy. It's always been a literacy strategy. In other words, this is what, because of the technical components of reading, in order to make those inferences, in order to connect the dots, you have to have a certain amount of background knowledge. If you don't have it, you're not going to be able to do this. So this is not about imposing a culture on kids. This is about helping kids be successful in the culture we have. That's very different. So that I view that as value neutral. Now, does it benefit me because I'm a white guy? I don't know. I mean, my kids were failing at reading tests for exactly these reasons, because they didn't have the schema, the background knowledge that I had. So now we can do one of two things, just like the grammar example. We could just say, well, we're going to ignore that and let them fail, or we can give them what they need to be successful. I mean, in a way, and it's funny, John was painted in the 80s as being this rock-ribbed conservative. He drives a Subaru. He's got an Obama bumper sticker on the back of his car. It's this incredible misimpression. It's the difference between progressive ends and progressive means. Everybody is, we teach for social justice. Do you want to I don't want to say condescend, but do you want to use? My concern is the end result of the education. Are the kids going to be given what they need to be successful in college, in career, and in life? If the teaching methods and the lack of curriculum is what's holding them back, well, you can hold on to these ideals or you can change them. That's just me. But that to me is not a very controversial stance. To me, that's common sense.
So, okay. So I'm just still stuck on the impediments, and to this approach, and I'm stuck on it because I'd like to think of an effective political strategy for this to be advanced. I think Bob's question is kind of trying to get at that, which is maybe if well-off families are okay, they're not pushing for this because they don't need it, and the poor kids, right? So that's
well-off families are more likely to push for it.
Right. So, but I also wanted to bring in the national standards.
Sure.
You were saying that, well, this is a good thing because at least it acknowledges that we need to know certain things, and the current version of national standards is making positive steps.
It's a delivery mechanism.
Right. But my concern is, I'm trying to think of the political logic of this.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, there are all these ed schools out there that you think are not teaching this strategy, and we don't know exactly why, for various reasons. But they're not doing it. We have all these schools out there that are not doing it. We have all of these, public intellectuals who actively fight against it, who are part of organized interest groups that, for some reason, don't want this. And then we think that we're going to sneak in from on top and make a set of national standards, and somehow push through all that and get everyone to do it. That's the part I don't get.
Well, I'm not.
It is that you think that if there's all this opposition and all these people not doing it, that you'll somehow be able to sneak into control.
Yeah, but
it seems more likely that Alfie Cohn will take over the national standards than he. right?
But I guess my point is that the national standards, qua the national standards, are not the issue. If you read the standards, they're not that materially different than any ELA standard. I mean, ELA standards are just different. They're not math standards that sort of, are very specific, or content standards like you might have in history or social. Do you agree?
Well, you're raising the question if they're not that materially different, why do we have them? But I think that one of the questions that this is leading to, that hasn't been mentioned, is the testing.
Right.
Then
Aren't you afraid that Alfie Cohen, or I don't know, that someone who with an idea that reading's all about skills, aren't you afraid that they're going to get hold of the standards and assessment mechanism somehow? And it seems to me that they're more connected and powerful
But Jay, they already have.
knowledge.
They already have. We're fighting a rearguard action here.
But how are you going to win that battle?
Well, again, I'm not saying that the standards are the issue. I call them a delivery mechanism, and I'm, as is my wont, I'm being somewhat arch, but I'm being earnest at the same time. You need to change teaching practices. Will the standards change teaching practices? Well, I don't know, but that's a nice commercial built into those standards for a coherent curriculum, isn't it? Again, that's not a guarantee that it's going to happen. You're absolutely right. You tell me what the tests are going to look like, and I will tell you what's going to happen in the classroom, especially in a high-stakes environment where teachers are worried about their jobs.
is Core Knowledge advising any of the test?
No.
Any of either of the testing consortia?
As far as I know, they're all behind a velvet curtain somewhere. I have no idea what they're doing. There are these two consortia, and I don't really know. We were a consultant to the Common Core state standards after initially being rather acid in our distaste for the first draft.
But testing?
But the testing, no, we are not involved in that. But from the perspective of a curriculum guy, you look at this and you think, okay, well, wait a minute. We've created the standards which tell what kids should be able to do, and now we're going to create the assessments that will determine whether or not they can do it. What's missing is the curriculum. I mean, this just strikes me as being lunacy. I mean, but Don has been arguing for years, you perhaps know, that for curriculum-based assessments. I mean, I wouldn't even talk about this, but here's an idea for ed reform. If you want to determine which teachers are the superstars and which ones are the laggard, well, reading comprehension, as this implies, is not really sensitive to instruction. It's every test of reading you take is a test of general knowledge, from the day you sprang from the womb until the day you take the test. So, we are overstating, I think, the influence of individual teachers to move the needle on reading comprehension scores. So if that's the case, John had this brilliant suggestion some years ago, let's have curriculum-based reading tests, which would have consequential validity, he said.
We don't have them. And how are we going to get them?
Well, exactly. And is this what the consortia are working on? I doubt it, to your point. Probably not. But how much more sensible would it be if fourth grade, if the state curriculum for fourth grade is ancient Greece, westward expansion, et cetera, the Vikings, the parts of a plant, why not take the reading passages for that year's reading test from the curricula? Because if you did that, then two things would happen. The kids would have the background knowledge, and the teachers would actually teach it. Why? Because it's going to be on the damn test. That makes so much sense to me. But the reason we don't? Because reading is a transferable skill.
Maybe last question.
Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to push back on you.
Uh-oh. That's Jay's job. Come on.
Because I'm going to say something really quickly that this felt like a very long commercial, is what it felt like to me. And it felt like what you were saying here, sir, is that F trumps A, B, C, and D. Now, let me go with this.
Okay.
Because if we have F, it seems like solution is as close to being solved as it would be. So Dr. Kestrel, Dr. Green, Dr. Ritter, they can all go home now. And so I'm trying to figure out, where does F play in A, B, C, and D? I'm really confused on this, because it sounds like to me, this commercial today, if we have F, A, B, C, and D are minor or unnecessary.
Not what I'm saying at all. And I this is why I had my entire preamble about I love charter schools.
Well, no, I got that.
Right.
I got that, and you may have lost half of the audience by doing that in the process. I mean, you won the Ed Reformers and lost the College of Education in that process. What I'm saying to you, sir, is if we have F, then why do we need A, B, C, and D? If this seems like, to me, this commercial solves the problem, Why is A, B, C, and D relevant in any sense?
Right, I am not a believer in any way, shape, or form in the true and only anything, okay? First and foremost, you can't have been in a struggling elementary school and say, if we just do this, then all problems are solved. That's just not reality. And that goes for everything on that list. You know, I'm not a believer that we need to hold teachers' feet to the fire, and if we do that, all problems will be solved. I'm not a believer in data systems as the true and only heaven, because what's the data system going to say? Oh, this kid needs help in inferencing. Well, inferencing in what? You know, these are not transferable skills. It's... I'm struggling to come up with an analogy. You know, you can't just treat one aspect of the problem and expect you're going to solve the problem. My point, and again, in speaking to the School of Ed Reform, I didn't realize I was speaking to the School of Education as well. You know, you guys are focused on A, B, C, and D. What about E? What about F? You know, you can't pick and choose. You got to do it all.
Well, Jay's argument is that A through D is a means by which you get F. The puzzle is we don't seem to.
Right. Right. And you know, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I understand why that is. I just know that the word is not getting out. You know, the way I was trained as a teacher, the way we seem to be training as a teacher, seems to be oblivious to this. Why? You tell me.
Part of it, I mean, as you pointed out, all the charter school teachers are coming out of the same ed schools where they
Yes.
reading's a transferable skill.
Right.
So
Right.
that's part of the problem. And Saul Stern's been making this argument, and I think he's right about that.
It's a whole issue that we see in many different respects, which is we kind of believe in competition, many of us, and yet certain things seem to be impervious to competition. There seems to be a whole cultural element. We see this in higher ed.
There's no accounting for taste.
You know, in higher ed we have competition, right? You can go to whatever school you want to go. It's not a neighborhood assignment, you know. And yet the same things that we complain about, you know, the same orthodoxies and things that drive us crazy appear in all of them.
Yeah.
And
you know,
another way also to think about, because we do not focus or can agree on F, or have a means for having widespread agreement, that is why the other things have come into play as possible substitutes, but they can't substitute for the content that should have been there to begin with. And so we're never going to move forward very far. You can mention something like you can only squeeze so much from whatever is there to begin with, which doesn't have F, if we're not willing to tackle F. But if F wasn't tackled by Common Core, which has been criticism of some of us, and the assessment people are going to determine it, and without any advice from people who are focused on content, how do we ever solve the basic problem at all? In other words, it may lead us further down a primrose path to the Wizard of Oz.
I have no reason to expect that the new assessments, whatever they may be, will be just like the old assessments in one significant way, which is they will assume that reading is a transferable skill. Because why? Because they have to. Because we're unwilling to even talk about F. So until and unless we start that conversation, we're going to have the same old, aren't we? You know, there's no way around it.
We will close now.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
You want any more lunch?
I don't know.